Leadership, there's ability to influence other people, the boss. By some accounts, the bad boss is one of the most enduring and pervasive problems in organizations. Scott Adams of Dilbert fame has made a fortune out of caricaturing the bad boss. And Mr. Dithers, Dagwood's boss, has been known for decades. So we've been studying leadership for a long time, and yet there seems to be this enduring problem of selecting and then having to deal with people who don't seem to have a clue about what leadership is about. What can organizational behavior tell us about leadership? How does it operate? How should we conceptualize it? Well, first let's try for a usable definition of leadership. If we can go to the monitor on that, the first of the overheads. Leadership? Okay. The influence of one group member over other group members to help achieve group or organizational goals. So the key is on influence of one person over the others. It should make a difference. There should be some impact felt on the group by the person who is the leader of the group to achieve not personal goals, we hope, although sometimes there is that perversion of leadership, but to achieve group or organizational goals. What are some traits that commonly come to mind when we think about leaders? Well, first, physical characteristics. Do they differ in any way? And the answer is yes. On the average, leaders tend to be taller than the rest of the group and tend to be more attractive than the rest of the group. So we're talking about the leader compared to the rest of the group. It doesn't mean that there is never a leader who is short. Napoleon springs to mind as an example. Or a leader who isn't attractive, because we can all probably conjure up people who are leaders in their field who don't bowl us over with their looks. But on the average, characteristics that turn up. Cognitive abilities is another area where we think about traits, and leaders are clearly smarter than the group on the average. That doesn't mean that the brightest person in the group is always going to wind up as the leader, because there are other characteristics that come into play. And if the leader is way brighter than the rest of the group, that might present a problem as well. But on the average, more cognitive ability there. And then there are a host of personality traits. Going to the next one, a number of things that we can take a look at. There is a tendency for dominance. People who are in leadership positions like to exercise their influence. They're also more energetic. You don't stay in a leadership position usually if you're low energy, phlegmatic type of person, because probably somebody's right behind you. So high energy level. Self-confidence. People who are leaders have an air about them that induces confidence from other people. If you're a leader, you need to have self-confidence because you want other people to be confident in you as well. So, another characteristic. Trustworthiness. We're going to come back to trustworthiness later on. This is a trait that turns out to be extremely important. And it's not to say that there aren't leaders out there who are not trustworthy, because clearly there are people out there who are in leadership positions that you have trouble trusting. But remember, I started talking about the bad boss problem, and that's one of the things that we characterize as the dark side of leadership, that there are people who get into leadership positions in the long run probably won't be able to remain there because they lack trustworthiness. Motivation to lead. People who are in leadership positions have to want to lead. It has to be that desire, that push, the drive to do that. Because, again, you don't stay in that position for a long time unless, of course, you happen to be an appointed leader like a king or a queen And even some of those abdicate. So, and then finally, flexibility turns out to be important too, and that's another one we're going to revisit. And you're going to see why it's important in order to be an effective leader, to be flexible. You can be rigid and be a leader, but not an effective leader. So a number of things. Well, actually, the first approach to leadership was the trait approach. Again, if we go to the overhead on that. Okay. Essentially, it was called the great man, the great woman theory, and this notion had as its basis that leaders possessed certain qualities that made them different, distinct from everybody else. It's as if you were born with these qualities somehow. The trait was there, the temperament was something you inherited in some way or other, and it blossomed. And no matter what situation you were placed in, you were destined to become a leader. However, the research over the years looking at traits left us kind of disappointed, because in the end, it was not able to come up with any really good list of traits that distinguished leaders from anybody else in the group. They kept trying on different things, and maybe you'd find it in one group, but it would not hold up over a lot of groups. Until, of course, more recently. And more recently, there are some characteristics that turn up, and some that I mentioned previously. The motivation to lead, flexibility turn out to be very important, and cognitive ability. You have to be bright in the long run to be a leader. It's not the only thing, but smarts do count in the end. There are limitations on this theory, however, and the limitations that exist are, as we will see when we start to explore other approaches to it, that different situations seem to call for different type of leaders. So the person who might excel as a leader in a new startup company would not necessarily be the best person to lead as that company matures and expands and stabilizes. You may need, at that point, a different type of leader. In fact, early research done showed that, in fact, as groups matured, different types of leaders were needed. You have to have somebody who can step back and now let the group take some of the responsibility for what's happening. So it brings us then to yet another look at leadership, and that is taking a look at leader behaviors. Where do we go with leader behaviors? Well, I've already suggested in terms of the trait approach, different situations need different types of leaders. And a series of studies carried out at Ohio State University over many years led to some very stable findings about leaders. Two styles emerge, very distinct styles. One is something that we will call people orientation, and keep that in mind as we go through, and the other is task orientation. Two characteristics that we see in the way leaders interact with the groups. The people orientation type of leader has been dubbed by the researchers consideration, and the style of this leader is one who is interested in the welfare of group members, interested in what satisfies them, and interested in being thought of as a fair leader. In other words, this leader is concerned with how the group members think of him or her. Consideration. The other style is called task orientation, and that leader is focused on getting the job done. This leader is going to spell out clear goals for people, will spell out procedures for people, will clearly communicate expectations, will clearly communicate schedules. This is when we need this work to be done, and let's keep focused on the work. You come in with a headache, deal with it. work with it. Okay, we still need you to do this work. This is what we've hired you for. Less concern with what's going on with any aspect of your life, and not nearly as concerned about what workers think of him or her. That's not why they were hired. They were hired to get the job done. So we have then the two distinctions, people and task. Does it make a difference for the group? And the answer is, sure, it makes a difference for the group. What are some of the consequences that we can see? Again, going to the overhead. For consideration, the style works well, works best, when the task is intrinsically satisfying. In other words, workers are going to be motivated, and it's not going to be the responsibility of the leader, the boss, to push workers to get the job done. They're going to get it done on their own. So in this case, the boss can step back and be concerned with other kinds of issues that might be important to this person as well, such as perhaps delegating responsibilities and authority, and again, this notion of being treated fairly. It also works okay when the task is extremely structured and clear. In that case, procedures are all spelled out. There's really no reason why the boss, the manager, the leader, has to spend time structuring things. That's done already. And so they can communicate in a different way and be concerned with different aspects of the jobs and be more concerned with workers. Consequences of initiation of structure. Concern for the task. That works best in situations where there's pressure due to deadlines, and so you need somebody who's able to keep the group focused on the task. This is when we have to get this out. Where are you in relation to the deadline? Or when the task is ambiguous, and again you need the boss to spell out what needs doing because it's not immediately clear to workers what needs to be done at a specific time. Or when there are external threats to the group. In other words, if you're in the military and you are under fire from a group, you don't want somebody patting you in the back and saying, how are you feeling today? You want somebody who says, ready, aim, fire. The focus on the task, the need to deal with the stress of the situation. So different situations, as we see, seem to work differently with different types of leaders. Let's take an example that's palpable to us right now. One of my favorites the whole semester, that football team, the New York Jets, because they've recently gone through a change in leadership. From the former manager, who seemed to be much more laid back and seemed to have concern with the various players, and the new one, Parcells, who may have concern with the players, but tells us in the news every Sunday after the game is over, my concern is what's going to work best for the team in order to get the win. And I'm going to make the selection not based on the feelings of the players, but I'm going to make my selection about who's going to get the job for that day, who's going to be playing out there, in terms of who I think is going to contribute most and get us the win. The task focus. Very different type of focus. It may mean that it works well for a while, and a team like that needs that kind of task focus. But you may also, at other points, if a team like that were to stay together and mature and begin to develop maybe some of their own internal leaders, need somebody who could back off, have the ability to back off, and then allow some of that to be picked up by the team, and you get a different, you need a different type of leader, or you need a leader who can act differently, one or the other. So we think about different types of leaders. A little bit before class, I was talking with some of you about bosses that you've known, good bosses, bad bosses, and what made them good or bad. If you go around and you ask most people about bosses they've known, they can say something about it. Kelly, do you want to tell us a little bit about some bosses you've known?
Well, one boss I worked with, I felt that she was a good boss because she did not she wasn't constantly on your back, watching over you, making sure you got every little thing done. She trusted you enough that you would be responsible and use your time wisely and do your work. And as long as you got results when she needed it, she didn't really bother you.
So, okay, so there was trust there,
Mm-hmm.
one of the factors that we had talked about. How would you characterize her? Would you say that she was more task-oriented or people-oriented? Is that a toughie?
Well, it depended. I mean, it depended. She was able to switch back and forth when necessary. I mean, if there was a project due and deadlines, I mean, she was very task-oriented where, you know, she stayed on you, made sure you did your work, made sure everything was up to date. But then when things were pretty much easygoing, you know, she was concerned about, you know, how you doing today and making sure that you were okay.
Okay, so she could adapt her style to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Sylvia, you had also mentioned something about leaders bosses that you've known.
Well, my experience wasn't like hers. Mine was a bad boss, I guess you could say.
We want to hear both sides.
Yeah, I used to work as a secretary, and I was working there for 3 years, and she never gave me a key to the office, so I basically had to wait for her to get there all the time to go in, and she would basically just go in whenever she felt like it, and not show up on the days that she was supposed to.
So she didn't trust you, in the sense that she wouldn't give you the key?
She promised me the key, and she was just, I guess she was an airhead. You can say an airhead because she never did.
I mean, we said that it doesn't mean that people who don't have some of the cognitive abilities or some of the traits that you would like to see in effective leadership get to those positions. They do, okay? And there are consequences for organizations, obviously, but this trust factor plays a role, reliability in this case. Anthony, you had talked a bit too.
Yes, the comment I made was that I found that the more senior of a position or formal leadership role a manager that I was dealing with was in, the more rewarding, satisfying the relationship was, just because that it seemed that individuals in those positions had a greater openness to ideas, so there's an opportunity for you to contribute, and willingness to take action. So if you needed their assistance, or they could open a door for you because of your idea, they had the authority and the desire and willingness to do that for you. So I just found that that was more satisfying whenever I was able to deal with more senior leaders, as well as that there was always the opportunity for mentoring. That if
Right. So again, we know that.
They would make you their prodigy.
Right.
Let
So.
you become their prodigy.
Okay. So we come back to again this sort of, when I say trustworthiness, and again it was openness to ideas in that sense. You didn't feel as if you had to censor anything in front of them, that you could bring ideas forward and they would listen. Communication, which brings me to Pat.
I've experienced frustration in the workforce with bosses when there was a lack of communication. Many times, I was given a task and some of the information was given to me, but not all of the information, so I was unable to complete the task in the way that was expected of me. I've also been given tasks and it was not made clear of what the expected outcome of that task was to be, so many times I was redoing work when it was unnecessary if I would have been given the entire information in the first place.
If they'd been explicit and clear about things, there are people who probably should have been more task-oriented than they were. Well, the interesting thing about this task versus people orientation is the two factors are really independent of each other. So we find then that there are people who can be high on task leadership, low on people orientation, can be high on people orientation, low on task leadership, can be high on both or low on both. And Kelly gave us an example of somebody who could be high on both. It sounds like probably that would be the case in Anthony as well, that they could handle both sides of things. In Pat's case, it sounds as if you had somebody, we have no sense of people orientation, but clearly weren't as high on the task orientation as they should have been. I guess you would think ideally it's best to be high on both, but there's no clear indication of how these factors relate to productivity. It's clear that they relate to satisfaction, and typically people who have people-oriented bosses report more satisfaction. That would make intuitive sense. The other thing that seems to emerge from this is that the people orientation works well or can make up for situations, work situations that are really horrible, where the work environment is really bad. As long as the task is structured, you're getting the information you need to be able to perform your task. If you're working in a lousy task environment, that people orientation seems to reduce the stress of working, I don't know, in the sewers all day long, if we have an example, if that's your work environment. So when I talk about work environment, I'm talking about a work environment that's really unpleasant to work in. And so that seems to ameliorate it or reduce it a bit. So yeah, we see that then, beginning to see and building to this notion of different styles work in different situations, which brings us then to a whole host of theories that are called the contingency approach. And there are several approaches under this domain, but the basic idea underlying all of them, and for the remainder of today, we're going to be considering 3 of them, is the idea that the most effective leadership style depends or is contingent upon the situation. You always know you're dealing with a contingency approach if you have a feeling coming out of reading it is, well, it all depends. That's what we mean with contingency. And the 3 that we're going to look at are Fred Fiedler's contingency model, Robert House's path-goal theory, and Hersey and Blanchard's situational leadership. It's 3 out of, there's some others there, but these are 3 that are fairly popular. The one that is probably best known, most researched, is Fiedler's contingency theory, and we're going to need that one up for a bit because it's somewhat complex. He's revised this and refined it over the years, but basically the concept is, can we keep it up there for a while? This one we're going to need up for a bit. Back to the contingency. Okay. That there needs to be a match between the leader's personality, if you will, and the situation. One of the key concepts, and there are a number of this, is the leader orientation. And he has described leader orientation as either being high LPC or low LPC, a somewhat complex concept. But it deals with how the leader is able to conceptualize and work with their least preferred coworker. And they have a series of scales that they have to fill out on the least preferred coworker. Essentially, you get characterized as a high LPC leader if, in characterizing your least preferred coworker, you can see some socially redeeming values. You don't like the person, but you're still able to evaluate that person high on a number of dimensions. You get characterized as a low LPC leader if, when you're thinking of this least preferred coworker, you essentially say, I can't work with you, therefore you're no good. Nothing about you is good. And so it's a somewhat more rigid thinking, compartmentalizing of a person, the low LPC. For practical reasons, I think it's easiest to think of the high LPC leader as people-oriented and the low LPC leader as task or production-oriented. It's not exactly like that, but it's close enough to make it easier to deal with this complex theory. So that's the leader, personality style of the leader. Now what about the group? So, well, the group gets characterized along 3 dimensions too, and we're going to be able then to describe situations as being essentially favorable or easy to lead on a continuum to being unfavorable or very difficult to lead. The most important of those dimensions, if we can go back to, good, the overhead there, is group relations. That's the most important. Is it good or bad? And in this case, it's group relations between the leader and the rest of the group. Does the leader get along with the group? Leader doesn't get along with the group. Dimension number 1. The second most important dimension deals with how structured the task is that the workers are doing. Is it a structured task, making it easier to lead because you don't have to spend your time telling people what to do and giving them guidelines and closely supervising them? Or is it a more unstructured task and it's difficult to lead? In other words, you have to more closely supervise what's going on unless you have super workers, and you can't necessarily count on that. And the third is position power. And I've shorthanded things here with strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, etc. In other words, how much official authority does the leader have? Does the leader have in that position a lot of authority, or is it relatively weak and there's relatively little authority, in which case the leader is going to have to rely on not position power, as we talked about last time, but personal types of power. Expertise, a little charisma could always help, information. Does that have to be relied on, or can you just say, do it, I'm the boss, do it, as an example? So these things combine into 8 quadrants, going from, in this case, very easy, which would be on the left of the screen, if we look at that, to very difficult to lead, which would represent the other end or the right-hand side of the screen. And then how do leaders stack up with that? What kind of leader for what kind of position? It turns out that if we begin to look at the effectiveness of the leader in the group, that a production-oriented leader really works best with conditions where things are fairly easy to lead, that there's good relations between the leader and the boss, there's probably strong position power, and it's a fairly structured task. I think we can come off that right now. At the other end of the continuum, again, the production type of leader works well, the task-oriented type of leader, because the situation is so bad that you can't really worry about people's feelings at that point. You have to go in and do the job. If you stop to worry what people are going to think of you, you're not going to be able to get the job done. So go in there, have a concept of what needs doing, probably have to rely on some personal power because you're not going to have position authority. You're going to have to spend time structuring the task, and don't worry about those relationships. Maybe they'll improve later when things get better. Now, what about in the middle? There things flip-flop, and it turns out that the high LPC leader is the one that seems to work best in mid-ranges of things, where the tasks are maybe a little bit more ambiguous and relationships are, could be good, probably not too bad. In that case, you have a different situation, and you need to be able to identify that type of situation, and you need a leader who's not on top of everybody all the time. You need a leader who can back off and allow the group itself to begin to determine what needs doing in that kind of situation. Don't structure it for them. Be trusting in them. Be willing to delegate some responsibility to the group. Let them participate some in the decision making. Don't be what we call a command and control type of boss in the middle. Well, what does this whole piece of research, what does the research say about how useful the model is? There have been loads of studies done, and with some consistency, we find that the results hold up. That if you classify situational conditions and you classify leaders, you find that the most effective leaders are the ones that have the good match. Favorable for leadership, unfavorable for leadership, production-oriented, and the middle range, people-oriented. But this has some interesting implications when you talk about real groups out there, because situations, in fact, change in organizations. We say products mature, groups mature, companies mature, and what starts out as fresh, young, and inexperienced gets older, more mature, and gets experienced and knowledgeable. Does that mean then, if you have this dynamic command and control leader marshaling everybody about in the beginning, that comes a few years, you have to change leaders? Well, initially, Fiedler said yes, because he considered this personality characteristic, LPC, to be fixed. And you don't easily change your personality. That's the style that's there. And initially, he was recommending change the leader, rather than having the leader change. We're going to see some differences later on. As he revised this, and as he came up with his own training programs, he said that, in fact, he thought it was possible not so much to change the leader, because personality is difficult to change, but maybe to change the situation so that it would be a better match to the leader. You might be able to do that. And so for leaders, perhaps, where there was not strong authority, the company could give that leader more authority. That's something that could be done. Where tasks were unstructured, leaders could work at, if they work best in a structured situation, of trying to make tasks more structured for people. Spell out those expectations that we talked about before. Don't leave things vague. Work on your communication skills in dealing with your employees. So some notions that perhaps the situation can be changed to be a better match for the leader if you can't go out and change the leader. But in some situations, clearly, it may make more sense to say, time for a new leader in this group. We've got to change things. And companies indeed do that. Sometimes they wait too long to change the leader, but changes do come about. How does this compare with some of the other models that we're going to be taking a look at today? Well, the next one is the path goal theory. And in this instance, we have Robert House, who suggests that the leader's influence derives from his or her ability to help subordinates achieve goals. In other words, they have to show the employee the path to arrive at the goal. And depending on what the goals are of employees, you need leaders to act in clearly distinct ways. And so House quite distinct from Fiedler, says the leader can change. Remember that concept of flexibility that we've been talking about, that concept of flexibility is an important concept, and leaders need to be able to change styles in working with different employees in different situations. So that's one of the variables, the style of the leader, and we'll get back to that, but I want to overview the whole thing. The second aspect, and leaders need to be able to diagnose this, is to look at subordinate characteristics. What are the abilities of subordinates to begin with? What are some of the needs? As well as the work environment. And here the work environment comes down to tasks again. How can we characterize tasks? Are the tasks structured or are they unstructured? Do workers have discretion in what they're doing? Or workers have no discretion and they absolutely have to follow a rule book? And you put these things together, and again it means that the supervisor has to be very analytical, and we should get some specific kinds of outcomes. There should be, first of all, more satisfaction on the part of employees, and along with that, acceptance of the leader or the boss. They're going to be more satisfied specifically with the boss, and presumably more effort. Well, in terms of research, the first two have been documented. The effort part is always the tough one to document in all of this. Let's back up and take a look at the different types of styles that are considered. Directive. When do you use a directive approach? And what is it like? You use it when you need to provide specifics to employees. It's this is what you do, this is where you do it, and this is when you do it. Sounds very much like task-oriented, and in fact, it is. So you need to think about, in that case, when do you match that up? You match it up with employee characteristics where employees are less experienced, less knowledgeable about what's going on, and are not inclined to become involved in their work particularly. So it works well in that situation. Supportive works well when it's important to establish good relationships with the employees and be concerned, again, with their welfare. That sounds an awful lot like the people-oriented approach. But this one adds two more approaches. The achievement approach, and in this case, the boss, the manager, the leader, would be concerned with providing difficult and challenging goals and then giving workers the means to carry it out. You're dealing with really a different type of employee at this point, somebody who has desire to be achievement-oriented, does strive for success, does want challenging goals. Well, it brings us back to things that we talked about when we talked about personality. Somebody who has a strong internal locus of control is going to be somebody who's going to need a boss, a manager who can discern that and help them set high achieving goals. And finally, participative. And this approach works well when employees want to participate in what's going on, want to be involved in what's going on, and want a certain amount of say in the work situation. So it allows them to become engaged. What does this all mean when we're trying to use this in the work situation? Again, leader match is very important, prime consideration. And it tells us that there will be less satisfaction with a boss who is trying to be achievement or oriented or participative oriented when the situation calls for directive. Wrong approach to take, or vice versa. It is key for the supervisor to be able to analyze what's going on in the situation, diagnose the situation in terms of employee characteristics and task structure, to figure out how employees are going to benefit from a style of leadership. One of the things that we started out with at the beginning of today's class was talking about cognitive abilities of leaders. And now you begin to see how the cognitive ability plays in, not simply in terms of knowing what the work is, knowing your subordinates' work, but having analytical abilities to know what type of style to use and what approach to use. A third approach is situational leadership. We got that up? Once more to the overhead. Situational leadership. Okay. Hersey and Blanchard's notion. Again, that the leader has to be able to diagnose the situation and has to be able to apply the right approach to doing this. Now, what happens in this situation? Again, there are two important dimensions: task behavior and relationship behavior. Task behavior refers to the amount of guidance that's needed on the part of employees. How much do you have to direct them? And how much do you have to instruct them in terms of what they're doing? Do they know what they're doing? They don't know what they're doing. If it's high, you have to give them a lot of this direction, and if it's low, they know what to do. They're experienced. The relationship dimension refers to the amount of emotional support and motivation that you need in dealing with these workers. For those workers who don't need much emotional support, who know their job, who are involved in the job, you don't need to do a lot with them. Back off. On the other hand, you may have employees out there who maybe want to do the job well. They're highly motivated to do it, okay? But you're going to have to work with them in some dimension because they don't know what to do. Or you can have workers out there who just don't bring a lot of work motivation to the situation. How are you going to engage them? What are you going to do? And it calls for, again, a different style of supervision to get these people working, keep them working, and monitoring what's going on in the task. That's a challenge. It's easy to manage workers who are highly motivated. The challenge for anybody out there is to manage workers where the motivational level is fairly low, to get them to do the job. And they've come up with, based on this, 4 different styles again. 4 seems to be very popular. In management, we like these 2x2 contingencies, and seems to make life simple. What do we come up with this in terms of the combinations? Well, if there is strong need to instruct and direct the employee, and you also need to do a job in terms of emotional support, encouragement, and motivation, the style that they come up with is selling. Here you have workers who are neither fully prepared to do the job, nor do they want to do the job, but you've got them there. And so you need to be like a salesman with these people in terms of instructing them what to do, and in terms of setting up some kind of perhaps close supervision to get them to do the job. The selling approach. Moving over, for those that still need instruction in terms of what to do, okay, but want to do the job, you can do telling. Okay, it steps it down a bit. You don't have to put so much salesmanship into it because they want to do the job. For these people, you just need to give good instruction. Here's how you do the job. And make sure that they follow through on doing it. Just get that ambiguity out of the way. One of the things that we've talked about. For those that understand how to do the job, but again need encouragement in terms of doing it, need the emotional support. They're knowledgeable, they're experienced workers. How do we engage them in terms of doing the job, because the motivational level doesn't seem to be there? Participating is the style. Use participation as a way of engaging them in their work. This does a couple of things in terms of workers. Participation allows them, if they have some feeling that they're unsure about, yes, they know what they're doing, but they seem to lack confidence in it, in terms of communicating with other people and understanding where other people are in terms of their skill level. So it gives them some reassurance. And the other things, we've talked about participation any number of times as a way of getting people involved in the work situation. So now you draw them out and you engage them in the work. And finally, delegating, where workers know the job, they're intrinsically motivated to do the job, let them do the job. Don't be on their back. Okay? Just give them the means to do the job and back off. What does this mean in terms of actually applying it in the workplace? And how useful is something like this? Well, this is one of the newer models of contingency theory. And so there isn't a lot of research on it. But we have some large organizations out there who've done extremely well in using it as a way of training their managers. And again, what it tells us in all of this is that there is a need to be analytical in terms of what you're doing. So now we've looked at two approaches to leadership. We've looked at the trait approach, and there seems to be something in the trait approach, and we've looked at the situation approach. And we say, well, there seems to be something in the situation approach too, trait situation. What is it? But what the trait approach is telling us is a few of the things that you've mentioned before, and it feeds nicely into the situation approach. Let's deal with flexibility. It says that people who tend to become leaders in lots of different types of situations, they're not going to be a leader just in one group. You put them in another group and they move into leadership as well. Can adapt. They can be flexible. I don't mean wishy-washy. That's not the case. But what they're able to do in terms of being adaptable and flexible is they're able to analyze the group, understand what group needs are, and adapt their style to the group. That's what we've been talking about all the time with contingency theories, adapting to different situations in the group. Cognitive abilities arises, important trait. Why is it important? Well, it's important, first of all, to know the job, but you go beyond that because the person who's most skilled at the job, promoted up to the next level, doesn't necessarily make the best boss. That was known as the Peter Principle, where you got promoted to your level of incompetency. You kept getting promoted up until you reached a point where you couldn't do the job. But the notion there is that it takes something beyond technical skills and knowing the job. That inspires confidence in your workers. You know the job. But going beyond that, that analytical ability to be able to understand what it is that your employees need in order to get the job done and give them the resources for doing it and respond to them in an appropriate type of manner. Analyzing situations. So that's important. The other thing that turns up that's important is a characteristic called, well, you need to want to have the motivation to lead. That's something that's enduring, okay? And whether we talk about a people-oriented leader or production-oriented leader, either style, there has to be, if somebody's going to be successful in leading, a desire to be in that kind of position and want to carry it off. But I want to talk about some other interesting issues as well. We've been talking about a lot of positive characteristics that appear in bosses. But one of the most interesting areas is an area called the dark side of leadership. The bad boss problem. For those of you who read Dilbert, you know that there are these characteristics of the bad bosses, and Scott Adams says he will never run out of material in terms of dealing with the bad boss issue. You can email him. I don't know what his email address is, but I'm sure some of you do. It's easy to find. You can track it down. And he says he gets a wealth of information. And so we're left with this perplexing situation in dealing with leadership of why is it we get people into leadership positions? You say, how do they get to that position and how do they maintain that position? Well, chances are they got into that position because they were technically proficient in what they were doing. But what's the dark side of leadership? What are those negative traits that come out that probably account for a lack of productivity in organizations and in the long run become destructive? Leaders who are not trustworthy. They don't trust their employees and therefore don't delegate to them. And in turn, the employees return the favor. They don't trust their bosses. What does that mean if you don't trust your boss? It means you're going to be very guarded about what you say. You're not going to open up at all in terms of what you're doing. You're not going to present ideas because you'll be afraid that either it will meet with a stony reception, or another trait on the dark side of leadership is that somebody will exploit the situation. They'll take your idea and use it for their own. Has that happened in organizations? I hear stories all the time of it happening, of people who come up with good ideas, present them to bosses, and the boss walks off with it as the boss's idea. How does that leave the employee feeling? Remember we talked about equity, feelings of fairness? Here's a sense that somebody's being exploited and being treated very unfairly in the organization. So they miss on that aspect as well. So, dark side of leadership, untrustworthy, exploitive, and then there's another side to them. There's kind of an emotional instability that they show. They can be expansive and warm and wonderful with their bosses, but then how do they treat their employees? Demeaning, degrading, they're great at yelling. And we'll say, how is it that people who are in these positions, we've got lots of situations of people who've been, we can go in history and see people who are the dictators of history, and the dictators in history replicate themselves in organizations as being dictators in organizations, and how do they maintain their power? Well, there's a lot of position power there for a while. They're able to cover up things for a long period of time. You take your employees' ideas and things can look really great. You present yourself to the people above you as if things are going fine in the organization. And if that's the only line because of communication power and position power, they're not going to be able to reach further down into the organization and find out about what is going on deep down in the organization. So the dictators can maintain their power for a period of time. But time runs out on people. And ultimately, things come out and situations start to collapse in organizations. And people like this are not going to stay in power. They're not going to be able to stay in power because at some point the sense of inequity among employees is going to build up. And the consequences are going to take different routes. Either employees will feel they're being treated so badly that they begin to group together and they'll go higher up in the organization and find some way of circumventing the boss, Or you find something else and probably the more frequent thing happens, and then it gets hard to cover that up after a period of time too. People leave. People are not going to stay in situations where they feel they're treated unfairly, and they're going to move on into other kinds of organizations, and you begin to get a lot of turnover and turmoil, and then you get a lot of inexperience in the situation, and there's just so long you can cover up all that inexperience and problems happening. And so, long run, it doesn't work either. So the bad boss is a problem. The dark side of leadership, unfortunately, is with us. The long run says that it's not going to work out. Can we learn anything from what we talk about in leadership in terms of selection of bosses? And the answer is yes, we should be able to learn something. We should be able to, if we can, look for the qualities in bosses besides the technical skills that make them able to go beyond management and shuffling papers around into leadership types of positions. And the qualities that you look for, and you need to engage in some kind of perhaps situational interview. It means that you really have to work hard in the selection process, is finding out about the flexibility of people, the trustworthiness of individuals, and again, through interviewing as best you can to select these qualities, their tendency to be fair with employees. We know what to choose, okay? We make mistakes in choosing. We make mistakes because we focus in on the wrong kinds of things in interview situations. We get hung up on things which are irrelevant in interview situations. We jump to conclusions. We tend to, too frequently, like people who are similar to us, and key in on that. We too frequently maybe go for the good appearance and forget that good appearance can just cover for so much. We started out by saying that, in fact, leaders have these physical characteristics. Why do we carry these physical characteristics in our head and want leaders to have these characteristics? Just been ingrained in us. And so we look for that. Somebody who doesn't look the role of a leader won't have as much a chance. Somebody who maybe doesn't have that commanding height doesn't have the chance. Interesting story that I did not relate to you at the beginning about physical appearance probably warrants a little bit of telling now to show you that, in fact, we do tend to rely on this too much. It goes back to the presidential debates between Carter and Reagan. In fact, Carter was shorter than Reagan. And in order to make them appear equal, they put Carter on a stand so that they had what was appearing to be the same presence behind the stand. You can't always do that. There was nothing they could do about Michael Dukakis. He also didn't win. So, you know, if we reflect on all of this and we wrap up with where we're going and what's happening in all of this, the answer is that we know what to look for. And yet, there doesn't seem to be a real intense effort to give us the types of leaders that we need. So, where have we been today? We've explored various concepts of leadership. We've looked at trait approaches and the various different personality characteristics, physical characteristics, cognitive characteristics that are needed. And we've looked at 3 contingency approaches. matching the leader to the situation.